go ahead and get this party started as soon as everything turns on. How's everybody's first week going? Great, busy. Running the gamut. Christian, is there a reason you've been ostracized? Okay. Jabin, you can hear me okay? All right. So we last left our hero, Toyota. And we've gone through some of the fathers of industrial engineering and various processes in our previous slide. And it kind of ended with Ford, and now we're moving on to Toyota. And so we had just talked about how the World War II event, the attack on Japan and their physical infrastructure, left them in a space where they physically did not have the resources to continue as they should, right? They didn't have people, they didn't have equipment, they didn't have raw materials. So they were having to do what we would consider now to be lean practices because that was their only choice. Otherwise, they just had nothing to work with, right? That's actually out of the necessity of making the most with very little is what led to what we now call the Toyota production system. What actually happened was fascinating. There's actually a whole bunch of American engineers that went over to Japan and talked to them about quality systems, talked to them about things that the major American manufacturers just really hadn't cared about. And so Ono went over to Ford and went through the Detroit plants and saw like, okay, here's a really good system with the continuous flow, the standardization of parts. They're doing great things from a quality perspective. They're being super efficient, except like they've got all these extra personnel, they've got this extra equipment, they've got this extra material, what we would then later name as waste. And the reason that this is important is when we think about Lean Six Sigma projects and when we think about doing continuous improvement, um, not everything is terrible all the time. It's easy to start thinking that, especially in production, where you're always firefighting the crisis of the day. But not everything is terrible all the time. We want to keep the things that are working well and make the improvements to make things better. So when you have a system that is doing things okay, and you can capture those things that are going well and enhance them and improve and work on the things that aren't, it helps to create buy-in. Because if you just come in and say like this is garbage, then the person that's been doing that for 20 years doesn't feel great about themselves, doesn't feel great about the work they've been doing. So in the effort to create buy-in, it's important to remember that we can keep things that are going well. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And so what we see in Japan is that Deming and Duran went over. They really helped them get this process going. They took advantage of other things that other American engineers were doing, like Stewart's PDCA cycle that we talked about. And when they came back to America and said, like, look, this is what we're doing, America said, I don't care. If you know anything about American history, post World War II, we actually were in a pretty good economic state. People were positive. The golden age of Americans, most of those people are in their 70s or 80s or dying off at this point. But it was this beautiful time that we were prosperous. We had won. The whole world loved us because when we finally did get involved, it felt like we saved the day. There was great loss in American soldiers who died, but there was also a great sense of patriotism. So unlike conflicts like Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, where you have a real mixed bag of social support for our veterans and the conflict in general. This was one that had the country really unified. There were very few people, even the pacifists, were signing up and just not carrying guns. People looked at it as a patriotic duty to go fight in this war. And from our perspective, we won. And we came back, and manufacturing was at an all-time high. Prosperity was at an all-time high. Confidence in America, in the dollar, in our productivity, all of that was very, very high. It's hard to tell someone who thinks everything's amazing to do things better. If you can ever think of a situation where somebody has a perspective like everything we're doing is great, and you say, you know, I can improve that, typically they'll kind of laugh in your face and be like, this is great. Things are great. Why on earth would I change it? You know, if the Baja cart ends up in first place, and who's going to want a moment to enjoy that before you start making changes? Not that changes can't be made, but you're going to want a minute to enjoy that. That'd be a major accomplishment. You give yourself a little space and time when you're doing things well to enjoy that. And so American manufacturing really wanted nothing to do with the Toyota way. So if you've seen the Toyota way in any of the previous books that you've looked at for other courses, like I said, I know Lara Gracia uses it sometimes, and I think McDonald's used it in the past. There was this triangle. And this triangle is the most important thing that I'm going to say for probably the first 3 weeks of the class. And you can't even read it. And it's not about reading it. It's about being able to read this word. Cody, can you read this word? Philosophy. Philosophy. When we talk Lean Six Sigma, lean comes down to a single word: philosophy. And anyone who's ever worked anywhere doing process improvement knows it's true. Anyone who's ever 5'd a system and then seen it return to crap in 2 weeks knows that the piece that was missing was not how you did the 5S, it was the philosophy. It was the culture. It was both how, from the newest temp hourly worker through the CEO, views continuous improvement. And that's a philosophy that has to permeate a lot of barriers, because up at the top, some of these things that we do that make small incremental gains over time aren't flashy enough to warrant attention. Down at the bottom, some of the things we do to make small incremental changes annoy the heck out of people because they want to keep doing it the way they've always done it, the way they feel comfortable. And everybody in between is wearing way too many hats to really care about your project. Philosophy. If people don't buy in, lean efforts are often undone. In fact, there was a long stretch of time in the late 90s, early 2000s, where article after article came out in everything from industrial engineering journals to the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times saying, does lean actually work? Everybody was questioning, does lean actually work? Because what they would see is they would see these practitioners come in with these great ideas and do these great projects that were immediately undone, that were continuously unsupported, both from the bottom and the top. And they said, well, what's the point in that? It's like skipping a piece of cake and calling it a diet and then drinking a 6-pack of beer. Like, you've just changed where the calories are coming from. You haven't actually made a difference, right? And that's how they were looking at these projects. They weren't actually making a difference, which is why actually for a long time, Six Sigma was a lot more popular. Six Sigma is data driven. They're much larger projects. They're done on huge scales. They require a lot of capital campaigns to inject money to get you started. And oftentimes it involves major overhauls that have the complete support of all of upper management and requires retraining all of your people. And there's systems in place to keep it going. That is the typical Six Sigma project, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s. It came out of Motorola, and it was all about big changes. Replace that whole line with something that's completely automated. get rid of this system and adopt a new software that utilizes AI. Big changes, big investments, big returns, super flashy, has to go through an extensive approval process. We'll be going through all of this starting in week 3. Six Sigma looked more successful, but the differential was not the continuous improvement. The differential was buy-in, and that's philosophy. Do you believe it? Do you believe that it works? This isn't some cult that you need to sign away your first child to. But if people who are involved in sustaining the efforts don't believe in it, it will not remain, because lean is all about small incremental changes, and it's easy for small incremental changes to disappear. So, philosophy, most important word in the next 2 weeks. All right. I just said all that. Great. So what's our concept of waste? Can anybody just spitball a few of them? Overproduction. Okay. You kind of petered off there in the end and just started saying words, but okay, we'll go with that. At the heart, if it doesn't add value, it's waste. So we have our 8 wastes. We're going to go through 7 of them. Unused creativity, I think, is what you were trying to describe there. Yeah. When we think about waste, anything that doesn't add value is waste, which means things that you do every single day are wasteful. And so we're going to talk about those things that are systemic, wasteful activities that we can't change. So for example, you might have, like in pharmaceutical manufacturing, the FDA requires 200% inspection at certain points. When your quality is good, you do not need 2 individuals to do 100% inspection of everything that you're doing. It's waste. It's a waste of time. Inspection is a waste. And yet, no, it's actually a regulatory standard. Now, changing the regulatory standard, that would move the needle, but it's a regulatory standard. So I have to do it. I have to do it. Frankly, I think the fact that we do sexual harassment training every like 6 months is a waste as employees. It wastes my time. None of the policies have changed. Take the people that are the problem children and give them an actual class that does something and leave the rest of us alone. Waste, regulatory requirement, institutional requirement. So you're going to come up against waste that you can't do a darn thing about. It doesn't mean they're not waste. It just means they're constraints of the system that you just have to accept that they're there. Or you can try to push back. We'll see how that goes. Depending on the circumstance, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. So our classic 7 wastes: overproduction, inventory, waiting, motion, transportation, rework, and overprocessing. And then we have our 8th waste of unused creativity. So when we think about all of these in the specific situation, this is part of why I talk about having a toolkit and you needing to be able to understand situationally which one applies. And the very first step of that is being able to walk in and see the waste, being able to look at a situation and assess where you can make those gains, large and small, because Lean Six Sigma is using both. We're doing small incremental changes and we're doing the big capital expansion, continuous improvement projects as well. We do both in Lean Six Sigma. Understanding where the issues are coming from a Six Sigma standpoint, we're going to do that in our analysis where we look at statistical controls. That's going to be all the math. In Lean, you really just need to have your eyes open. The Ono circle was one where he stood in a circle and watched something for 8 hours. The guy didn't even take a bathroom break. My bladder's not meant for that, frankly, but he would stand for 8 hours, an entire shift, and just watch you. And that's not the point. What Tyler just did, picking up his pen and starting to write, was actually not the point. He didn't want people to try to work faster while he was watching. He wanted to understand the system. So to identify waste, you have to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And this requires a healthy dose of humility. People are already upset that you just got hired in at double their salary because you went to college for 4 years and they didn't have that opportunity. They're already not thrilled about that information, and everybody knows it. When you who does not understand how to do their job then stands over them and watches them and tells them how to do it differently because it's better, not received well, by the way. Leo was talking about how it was really helpful that he had worked in Barry starting in the production line so that when he came to do continuous improvement, he was someone who could actually say, I've done this job. I know why we do it this way. There's a better way to do it, but I know why we've done it this way. I know what you're doing. I know the instructions you've been trained on, the processes you're doing. I know how the equipment works. That knowledge gave him an in to then collaborate with the workers and feel like he was coming alongside rather than wagging a finger saying, actually, it would be better if you did it this way, right? So overproduction is considered the root of all evil when we think of lean, because everything else that you do will come back to overproduction. If you are overproducing, you have too much inventory. If you have overproduction, you are wasting motion. You are hiding rejects and defects and rework that needs to be done. You have excess transportation. You have overprocessing taking place. All that happens, and the root is overproduction, which is why one of the first lean tools is leveling out production, saying, what do we actually need? Even if you're making to stock, what do you actually need and how do you know that? So go straight into inventory, excess inventory. I can't tell you how many places I've worked that look exactly like this, exactly like this. And they weren't warehouses. That was the production floor. That was like a corner of the production floor would be stacked with raw materials, finished goods, work in process, all jumbled up together, not being processed correctly, not being taken to the same place, because every inch of floor is valuable. And so if there was an inch of floor where they could put something and stack it 5 pallets high, that's what they were going to do. But that shows this excessive nature that's just not going to work. Waiting. I moved all of these. I don't know, like all the words are behind, and I spent like a good, I don't know how long, but moving all this. Poor girl. She's sad. She's waiting. Don't want her waiting. Hanu's not going to keep her waiting very long. When you're waiting, you're not doing anything. How many times have you gone by someone who's doing nothing, and the reason that they're doing nothing is because they're waiting? A quality check, a supervisor to fix something, an order to come off the line from a cook. Every job has waiting. Every job has a place where people are standing around getting paid doing nothing. Some jobs have more of that than others. When I have to send my travel authorization for my conference through, and it's just sitting out there in somebody's inbox, and I can't move on to the Chrome River step because I have to have that signed before, it's going to take 2 weeks of this document moving through from email to email, waiting for days on end at everybody else's workstation to rubber stamp it because everybody already agreed I could go. I had to get that before I could even fill out my form. And now I'm waiting for them to rubber stamp it so I can put it into Chrome River so travel can tell me how I filled out Chrome River wrong, which is really ridiculous that we do it at all because they're the only ones who care about Chrome River. They're the ones who should fill it out. That's a different story. That's Cuban's drum to bang on for a while. But the process is full of waiting. Nothing can happen until someone does something else, and there's no flow. So even electronic processes, even administrative processes, desk jobs, full of waiting all the time. You look like you were going to say something. Yep. And you can't, there's a limit to how much you can do. There's a certain point where you just truly cannot do anything else until you have the parts in, because you can't start your manufacturer, assembly, testing. That whole back end of senior design cannot be done until you get past that. So yeah, waiting, always an issue. Transportation. Every single time I move stuff, I am wasting time. Why isn't where it's supposed to be? This is one of those things that people can have a real hard time intuitively, like, but how it has to get there, right? Like the cow is in the field. That milk has to go to a processing center. That processing center sends it to the grocery store. My shopper for Instacart has to walk back to the refrigerated section, bring it, and then drive it to my house. All of those steps are transportation. That's just how it works. That's time and space are realities. We can't beam stuff to people yet, like on Star Trek, right? You have to move stuff. True. But it's not actually adding value. Nothing has changed about the product while it was being transported. It just moved location. Yes, Leo overthinks everything. It's an interesting concept, though, the value add on positionality and location, because when we talk about facilities design, I mean, location is everything, right? I mean, in personal real estate, location, 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 right? Location does matter, but why does it matter? Because proximity reduces transportation costs, it reduces transportation time, it gets your parts to you faster for senior design and eliminates the waiting. So yes, location matters, and certain locations do add value to the overall process, but it's proximity that is truly the value that's being added, because they're still having to invest in the transportation and nothing's happening to that steel as it's being transported. Yes, right. Yep. Because from the customer standpoint, however long it took to get across the border, which is not very fast right now, that's delaying them, just like you're being delayed right now waiting for your parts. That delay is costing you. So the transportation is directly aligned to waiting, which is why it contributes to the waste. But I see what you're saying. I appreciate that. So this offshoring, reshoring tension, it really kind of fluctuates with cost. And it's really stupid, actually, for these very expensive capital projects for very short-term gains that are volatile, because we don't control any of the overseas governments or anything, which makes it a prickly situation. There's always somewhere you find that's going to do it cheaper. Before it was doing everything in China, then it was doing everything in the Philippines, then it was doing everything in Venezuela. Like it migrates where the cheapest labor is. It migrates where the least restrictive labor laws are. Like if you're playing that game of lowest cost through cheap labor or unregulated factory situations, you're always going to be chasing it. But that is why. I mean, you have that proximity to the workers, sometimes to the raw materials. So for example, I was looking at these really super high thread count sheets. Denise, you were in that class. What class was that? Was that, I think that was inventory, production and inventory control that we were looking at that. Do you remember those really expensive thread count sheets? They were like $2,000 for a set of sheets. Yeah. Now, obviously, if you're spending $2,000 for a set of sheets, we have different lifestyles anyway. So like, I probably just don't understand the value of $2,000 sheets, but they actually did all because everything was hand woven in Africa because they were using Egyptian cotton. And that was their whole thing that they were using, and it was Egyptian labor right off the Nile doing this weaving of the Egyptian cotton to make this super, super fine, breathable, organic, wonderful cotton sheets that sold for $2,000. That is for a king size bed. King size bed sheets are more expensive, but still, $2,000, no thank you. So location of moving the workers to the raw materials to the process, having all those in the same place has that benefit. But the customers are not their neighbor country, Ethiopia. Their customers are high rises in New York City, Hollywood, Chicago. Like, it's still having to do that transportation, right? Like at some point, and that's one of the things that you try to balance, because when you do move certain pieces of it for that better proximity, you're still transporting it at some point to the end user. And the further you are from the end user, the more transportation you have at that end. So figuring out that balance of where you want your people, your product, your raw materials, your processing, all of those steps in relationship to the customer are something that you have to navigate. But the truth of the matter is the locals there are not buying these $2,000 sheets. So you don't have the perfect storm there. Like, but it does make sense that you would have certain different pieces in proximity with one another. Excess motion. I can't remember where I found this picture of the granny on the file cabinet, but it cracks me up every time I see it. So anytime, this is where Frank Gilbreth comes in and industrial engineering, where it's all about the workplace design. So how many of you guys took Nelson's class on work center design, workplace design? So when you take that, hopefully you talked about the ergonomics associated with how much movement and especially wasted movement was going to happen with an individual that had to go different places for their tools, have awkward positioning for their process, because anytime you're in an awkward position, your fatigue increases, so your productivity decreases. The amount of time it takes increases, so your productivity decreases. Anytime we're transporting things, we already covered that. That's terrible. So we don't want to be walking around a lot. So this excess motion really comes down to workplace design. Rarely is it a case of an individual, although I have seen one particular lazy tool and die guy that intentionally kept his toolbox by the back door so he could smoke like every 5 minutes. But tool and die guys are really hard to find, so nobody was ever going to fire him. But he really did keep it very far away from him just so he could increase the number of smoke breaks he had. He thought he was pretty smart about that, actually. But typically, if we were doing workplace design, we would want all the equipment, the tool, the materials in close proximity to the worker, as well as having a system that allows them to move freely within them. Braden Wick's senior design was all about integrating new automation in a way that the people could move around it easily, because they had gotten all of these new automated things and reduce the number of workers, but the workers still had other tasks. And if you just put the equipment in without any thought to it, you actually were extending the tack time because it was taking people longer to navigate the new work cell. So it was automated and had slowed it down. And his job was to fix it. And that became a senior design project, which was very valuable because he fixed it. He fixed it by talking to the workers, saying, what do you need to do? Where do you need to go? Mapping out their travel paths. And then they had to buy a new conveyor and change some of the process a little bit. So it was more involved than it sounds, but it was just basically like redoing a layout because it was taking too long. Overprocessing can be seen in a lot of different ways. Amazon's getting really crazy about this. And Denise, I don't know if you had experience of this when you were working at Amazon, but like I've taken pictures numerous times and like post them to my Instagram of getting the huge box with like an eye cream in it, and the rest is all that air bubble fill stuff. Now, why they didn't send that in the plastic bag mailer instead, or just stick their own shipping label on it, with it already being packaged. My mom bought a new electric blanket from Amazon and it was already in the other person's packaging and all they did was slap the Amazon label on it. Like those things make sense. That's efficiency. That's reducing waste. That's reducing packaging costs. That's the opposite of what happens. I don't understand the inconsistency with that coming from Amazon in particular. But anytime you have lots and lots of packaging, that's overprocessing. But it's also overprocessing when you have to rework the same thing. When I have a mistake and I have to go back and do the same thing twice, I've just doubled my time, doubled my materials, doubled my equipment run hours. And the customer's only going to pay for it once. They're not paying for my error. So those defects are automatically overproduction, overprocessing, excess motion, excess transportation. It's like all the waste in one rolled up into having defects and scraps. So one of the biggest things about becoming lean is exposing the waste so that you can create these pull systems that allow you to have a value stream that is in the majority of adding value to your process every step of the way. And yes, because we can't beam stuff from one place to another, there's still going to be transportation, but we can try to navigate that as best we can. Yes, our company might require, or our regulatory commission might require certain steps that would be seen as wasteful to us. We have to consider those to be constraints. But for everything within our power, the more we pursue this value stream that emphasizes value add activities and diminishes the wasteful activities, the closer we'll get to a lean system. And none of this happens without human creativity. None of it happens without somebody looking at a system from a philosophy of continuous improvement. You have to have that every time, because most of the time what we end up doing is we end up doing it the way we've always done it, because the routine feels efficient. We feel like we can move faster in things that we've done well. How many people have like a morning routine? Like you do this, you do that, you do that. Like you know how to execute your morning. Okay, for those of you who have a morning routine, how many of you have a fast version of the morning routine? The, oh shoot, I slept through all of my alarms, but I still need to get out the door. Oh, you have like two separate routines? The fast version and the slow version? Okay, but you can do like the 30 seconds brushing your teeth instead of the 2 minutes. I mean, yeah, the toothbrush yells at you, but the toothbrush is an inanimate object, so I'm not going to care that much, right? Okay, but 15 minutes in a hot shower just sounds absolutely divine. Like to me, that's a place where I can buy time. Like you do not require that long to take a shower, like washing yourself. I mean, you're a tall guy, but still, it's not 15 minutes. Um, no, I appreciate that sounds like luxury to me. That sounds like luxury. Okay, but this is an important point. Not Tyler's shower habits, but the choice, right? Because we encounter this all the time. Because I take that same 12 minutes and enjoy it in my silent house with my coffee and my puppy laying in my lap. And I get to stroke my puppy and sip my coffee. And I'm not pondering anything at that point. I'm just enjoying the quiet of the morning, watching the sunrise, having that piece of calm before all of the people and animals in my house start getting up and active and loud and the craziness begins. That's sacred to me. So if I wanted to give that up, I could get the other 12 minutes in the shower. It's a choice. When we look at continuous improvement, very rarely do you not encounter places where you have to choose. And this is part of that sustaining. This is part of that philosophy, because sometimes we're asking workers to give things up. When I proposed moving the toolbox, the guy laughed at me. He was not giving up his cigarette breaks. That was going to improve the system, but not improve his life. So he was not going to support that at all. And if I had made him move it, he would have moved it back at the end of his shift and looked me dead in the eye and just been like, what are you going to do about it? He was that type of guy. He knew we couldn't replace him, so he didn't care. When we're looking at improvements, your improvement might go up against a cultural value. I had a group of people working at a production facility, a large production facility that did lots of lean initiatives very successfully. And this one area we were having trouble with, and nothing was improving, and we couldn't figure it out. We had a group of 4 older women, and the new process broke them up. And they talked all day while doing their job. They were friends, but like work friends. They didn't see each other outside of work. But part of what made their job good to them was knowing that they liked the people that they worked with. And when we tried to split up all the teams, we got roadblock after roadblock after roadblock because they wanted to work together. That was valuable to them. And they didn't want to support any system that would change that dynamic because it would decrease their enjoyment of their workday. Once we figured that out, we could retool the plan with that as a constraint. We're keeping these 4 people together. And then we were able to smooth sailing, make the improvements. But I didn't know that because I didn't work every day with that. I didn't know them. And it was in a casual lunch conversation with someone else because I was a consultant. I didn't know most of the people there. And I was sitting there and their supervisor was like, yeah, well, they probably just don't want to be separated. And I looked up and I was like, what? I'm like, oh, they talk nonstop. Their quality is tip top. Their productivity is right on time. But they, like, you can't get a word in edgewise. The 4 of them just the entire day. Oh, that was a piece of information I didn't know. That doesn't show up on a process flow that an engineer had created 2 years ago. That's not part of a standard operating procedure. That's culture. And I was pushing against it, and they didn't want to give that up. So Tyler, thank you for your excellent point, because part of our process improvements is not just the process. It's the people that are working in it. And if you want them to buy into your philosophy of that improvement, they have to see the value for them, and you can't push against things that they already value. Not that they can't be willing to change, but you have to understand because it's all a trade-off. And maybe this is the thing that they hold really sacred and they're willing to move on that. But because you don't know that, you're trying to get them to move on the sacred thing instead. So understanding those choices is really, really important. Okay. So we're going to start on Monday. No, no, we don't have Monday's class. I might have to do this as a homework assignment. Okay. When we look at doing flowcharts to find waste, actually, I think I'm going to have you guys do it as a homework assignment, and then we'll evaluate them on Wednesday in a group, and we'll put them up on the doc camera. When we want to map a process flowchart is extraordinarily helpful, especially when we can bring clarity to where those wastes are happening. So not so much concerned about the traditional logic flowchart you see for a computer program, or it's not necessarily the rigid schematic approach that we might have when we're presenting things to other people. Your first process map should be like quick, hand-drawn, making notes to yourself of what you're observing and questions that you're collating so that you can then further pursue, is this an opportunity to address a waste here? You want to just be focused, and rather than focusing on getting it right, you want to focus on what do you see? What potential could exist? There will be a time and place to get it right. It's called presenting to your stakeholders. We'll get there. But the very first step is understanding, asking the right questions, because you want to make sure you're picking the right process. And one of the things our book starts with is, how do you choose a project? Well, one of the things we have to understand in choosing a project is we need to know if we can make any gains. So you kind of have to be anticipating an outcome before you even get started. Because if you're looking at something that you have zero control over any of the steps, who cares? I can't fix that. I'm not going to waste a minute there. But I see some low-hanging fruit over there. That's something I can attack. Which is why the Six Sigma projects often are total reworks. They're not looking for quick wins. They're not looking for low-hanging fruit and little areas of waste. They're saying, bulldoze it down, clean slate, new system. And that means you can craft the whole thing start to finish. You're in control of all of it. But in Lean, we're looking at small, quick gains. So I need to have the anticipation that there's a potential there. I don't need to know exactly what it's going to be, but I have to have a degree of confidence that I can find it. And so if you look at something and you're like, yeah, I don't know, I don't even know where I would start. Well, don't start with that production line. Don't start with that project, because you need to have a starting point. And so these first flowcharts in finding waste are really a very personal document of you mapping your understanding and mapping out your questions. And so what I want you to do, while you see there are standards for the different symbols, I really don't care. Frankly, typically when I would do this, I would just have boxes, because I don't need to know that an oval is something and a circle is something else. I've got my own kind of shorthand for my own types of flow charting. And the more you do this, the more you develop your own type of shorthand of that you understand, but nobody else would necessarily get, which is why we do translate it to Visio, and maybe we make it really pretty, that even Mr. Nelson would be proud of us. But our first draft, our first draft is not that. Our first draft is helping us ask the right questions. And that's where I want to start, because too often in classrooms, we try to get you to do like the fancy, full-blown, professional, present to everybody else thing. But that thing is like the final step. Honestly, most of those pretty graphs and charts and depictions of flow charts, I would make the night before the presentation. That's not what I functionally worked off of. What I worked off of was scraps of paper and notes and sketches, and I didn't have an iPad at that point. It was too long ago. I'm trying to act like I'm younger than I am. No, it would be on graph paper. I carried around an engineering tablet all the time so that I could make sketches. I could do things to scale. I could do calculations really easy. I could take notes. I just had a green pad and a folio tucked under my arm at all times with a very sharp mechanical pencil and extra lead in my little pouch. Because that's all I needed to be able to map it out and know what I was looking at and identify my questions and start asking. And when we start asking our questions, we need to ask them of a whole lot of different people. We need to ask the people who are actually doing it. We need to ask the people who are supervising the people doing it. 80% of the time, they're not going to say the same thing. Sometimes they do. Some organizations, they're a little closer on the same page. Then we need to talk to stakeholders, people that can actually give us the yay or nay, give us money, give us resources, approve the change, and make sure that they're on board with the concept before we get too far down the road. All of those things come from the questions that we make with this initial draft, quick and dirty process flow that is really just for you to understand. So what I'd like you to do is we're going to stop here because it's 8:45 and Kicklighter is going to get mad if I hold you late. But your assignment, and I will post this to Blackboard. You do not need to submit it on Blackboard. You do not even need to physically turn it in, but you do need to be able to present it on Wednesday. That's so far away. A week from today. We won't do everyone in the class. So if you do something to complete this and are then like, mine's terrible, don't use mine, I will check off that you've completed the assignment and I will not make you use yours. But what I would love to see is I would love to see each of you identify a process that you can visually see some low-hanging fruit that gives you questions you would ask. This could be at the station to pick up your textbooks in the campus bookstore. This could be at your part-time job that you are doing to pay the bills. It has nothing to do with engineering, manufacturing, anything you plan on working on. Or this could be at Berry Global and actually turns into a project that you do that you actually get paid for. I don't really care about the location of it. What I care is that you see a process that has some identifiable waste and you make lists of questions. That's what I'm looking for. And I'll hope that about 4 of you can do something worthy of discussing as a class for Wednesday. I'll post that to Blackboard. Have a great day. Have a great weekend if I don't see you. And I will talk to you later. All right, Jabin, I'm going to stop this now. You can reach out if you have questions.